Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling, well, a huge question. It's one that's echoed through pretty much all of human history. You see it in art, like Michelangelo's creation of Adam, the whole idea of God's nature, God's existence.
It really is timeless, isn't it? A fundamental question that philosophy, religion, cultures everywhere have wrestled with for centuries.
So our mission for this deep dive, using our source material today, specifically some excerpts from religion1.pdf, is to try and unpack some of the philosophical thinking around what we even mean by God, and whether belief in God can actually be rationally justified.
We're aiming to give you a clear path through this really complex topic, hopefully without it feeling too overwhelming, maybe even spark a few aha moments along the way.
Exactly. So, okay, let's jump right in. The big one. What do we mean by God? It sounds simple, but it seems like there's no single answer everyone agrees on.
No, definitely not. The word gets used in so many ways. Everyday conversation is one thing, but philosophical or theological definitions, well, that's often quite different. Our source points out that in monotheistic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, God, usually means one supreme being, personal, creator, ruler of everything.
That kind of distinct, all-powerful, all-knowing figure who's separate from the world he created.
Yeah, exactly. That's a common understanding. But then philosophy throws in different angles, like St. Anselm's definition, than which nothing greater can be conceived.
The maximum greatness idea. So God isn't just a being, but the absolute peak of perfection, containing all the best possible attributes.
Precisely. It anchors God in this concept of maximal greatness. But, crucially, that's not the only way people think about it. Our source, 1000wordphilosophy.com, mentions that sometimes people use God much more abstractly.
Like equating God with nature, or maybe love.
Exactly, or just the universe itself. And you can see how that dramatically changes what it means to say God exists.
Yeah, as God is the universe, then saying God exists is almost like saying the universe exists, which is, well, hard to argue with since we're in it. But that's worlds away from believing in a personal creator.
Absolutely, and that brings in pantheism, too. The idea that God isn't just in everything, but God actually is the sum total of everything. The universe itself is divine.
Like Spinoza thought, or maybe some interpretations of Brahman in the Upanishads.
Those are great examples. So the definition is critical. It completely shapes the claim being made, which naturally leads to the next question. Can we even define God fully?
That's a deep one, because we try, right? We come up with these concepts.
Yeah.
But then there's the argument that God, if infinite and transcendent, is just beyond our finite human minds.
Our source mentions a theologian describing God as wholly other, but also wholly same, the mystery of the self-evident. It sounds paradoxical.
It really does. Like, our concepts can point towards God, maybe, but they can't fully capture the reality, like trying to describe the ocean by looking at a cup of water.
That's a good analogy. But as the text notes, for philosophy of religion to even function, we need working definitions. And the one that often comes up, especially in classical theism, is this idea of God as eternal, omnipotent, all-powerful.
Omniscient, all-knowing.
Omnibenevolent, all-good. And also a necessary being, the creator of everything. That gives philosophers a common ground to start discussing arguments.
Okay, so wrapping up this first part. God means different things to different people. Personal creator, abstract principle, the universe itself. And while we have philosophical definitions, maybe the full reality is beyond definition. Got it. So these different definitions obviously lead to different kinds of belief systems, different theisms, right?
Exactly right. The concept of God you start with shapes the kind of theism you end up with. Monotheism, as we said, is belief in one single God.
Unique, all-powerful, all-knowing, the ultimate source. The Abrahamic faiths are the key examples here.
Yes, and they really stress that God is fundamentally distinct from the world he created. There's a clear separation.
Then you've got polytheism, belief in many gods.
Right. Think ancient Greece or Rome with Zeus, Athena, Apollo, and so on. Or Hinduism, where you have deities like Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, sometimes seen as different aspects or manifestations of a deeper divine reality.
And these gods, they usually have specific jobs or domains, like god of the sea, goddess of wisdom.
Often, yes. And importantly, they're usually depicted as powerful, but not necessarily infinitely powerful or knowledgeable. They exist within the cosmos, they interact, they sometimes have conflicts. It's a very different picture from the single transcendent God of monotheism.
Definitely. And related to that, our source mentions henotheism, worshiping one God as supreme, but not denying others exist.
Exactly. It's a sort of middle ground. And then we circle back to pantheism.
God is everything. All is God.
Yes. The divine isn't separate, it's completely immanent. Spinoza's idea of God as the single substance encompassing all reality is a key example, or some Eastern views where Brahman is the underlying reality of everything. It tends to be a more impersonal view of the divine.
And you mentioned related ideas too, like deism, God creates but then steps back.
Right, a creator God who doesn't intervene.
Yeah.
And panentheism, God is in everything but also transcends everything. So God is more than just the universe.
Wow, okay, so it's a whole spectrum. And keeping these types in mind is important, you're saying, because arguments about God often just assume one type, usually that classical theistic model.
Very often, especially in Western philosophy. But clearly, the concept of the divine varies hugely around the world. Okay, so we have these different frameworks. Now let's zoom in on the attributes usually given to God, particularly in classical monotheism.
The omni-words.
The omni-words are key. First up, omnipotence. All-powerful.
And that means literally capable of doing anything.
Well, generally it's understood as the power to do anything logically possible. Aquinas, for instance, argued God can't do things that are self-contradictory, like make a square circle, because a contradiction isn't really a thing to be done. It's more about unlimited, sovereign, creative power.
But this is where that stone paradox comes in, right? Can God make a stone so heavy he can't lift it? Seems like a logic trap for omnipotence.
It absolutely is a classic puzzle, and we'll definitely loop back to it when we talk about arguments against God's existence. But for now, the core idea of omnipotence is that ultimate creative power within logical bounds.
Okay. Then omniscience, all-knowing.
Yes. Complete knowledge,
Yeah.
past, present, and in many views the future, every detail, every thought, every possibility.
Everything there is to be known, as one source puts it.
Right. But this immediately raises questions about free will, doesn't it?
Yeah, if God already knows exactly what I'm going to choose tomorrow, am I really free?
It's a huge philosophical tangle. People have proposed solutions. Maybe God exists outside of time. Maybe he knows all possibilities, but not the definite future. Maybe our definition of free will needs adjusting. But the fundamental idea of omniscience is that nothing is hidden from God.
Got it. And the third, big omni, omnibenevolence.
All good. Perfect goodness, moral perfection. God is the ultimate standard of good, incapable of evil, desiring the best for creation.
Sometimes expressed as perfectly holy, loving, just.
Exactly. And this, of course, runs straight into the problem of evil. If God is all good and all powerful, why is there so much suffering? Another major issue we'll tackle later.
Seems like these attributes, while defining perfection, also create the biggest philosophical headaches.
They certainly do. Then there's eternity or timelessness, God existing beyond time.
So either completely outside time, past, present, future, all simultaneous for God. Like Boethius's eternal present.
That's one view, timelessness, or the view that God is everlasting, existing through all time, without beginning or end, but still interacting within time.
Either way, it means God isn't finite like us. No birth, no death, infinite duration, sometimes linked to immutability, God being unchanging.
Yes, those concepts are often connected. And our source lists a few others briefly. Omnipresence, everywhere at once. Impassibility, incapable of suffering or emotion in the human sense. Aseity, self-existent, not depending on anything else. And necessary existence, must exist, cannot not exist.
Wow. So taken together, these define the omni-God of classical theism. The Abrahamic faiths generally include at least the big three: omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence.
That's right. And the argument often goes that if God lacked any perfection, God wouldn't truly be. God wouldn't be that than which nothing greater can be conceived.
But as we keep hinting, these attributes lead to tough questions. Evil, free will, logical limits.
Absolutely. Philosophers examine these puzzles to test if the concept of God is even coherent. We'll definitely encounter these again when looking at arguments against God. But for now, the takeaway is that the God of philosophical theism is this maximally perfect being, ultimate power, knowledge, goodness, existing eternally as the source of everything. Okay, now that we've sort of mapped out the concept, the next huge question is, can we actually justify belief in such a being through reason, or is it purely a matter of faith?
The faith versus reason debate. This feels like the absolute core of so much religious philosophy. Can you use logic and evidence, or do you just have to believe?
It's a central tension, and thinkers have landed on very different sides throughout history. On the one hand, you have what's called natural theology.
People who think reason can lead us to God, like Aquinas and his 5 ways.
Exactly. Aquinas believed you could rationally demonstrate God's existence by observing the world. And similar rational arguments popped up in medieval Islamic philosophy, the Kalam tradition, and Hindu philosophy, like the Nyāya school. These thinkers generally saw faith and reason working together.
Kind of like Anselm's faith-seeking understanding, using reason to explore what faith holds.
Precisely. But then you have modern evidentialists who take a harder line. They argue that belief in God is only rational if you have sufficient evidence. Your belief should match the evidence, just like in science.
And famous skeptics like Hume and Russell looked at the traditional arguments and basically said, nope, the evidence isn't good enough.
They found the arguments lacking, yes. The evidentialist logic is, show me the proof, or belief isn't really rational. But then you have the other side.
The faith alone camp.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
Well, many argue that religious belief doesn't hinge on proof in the scientific sense. Faith itself can be rational in a different way. You have fideism, which basically says reason is the wrong tool for the job when it comes to God. Religious truths are accessed by faith, maybe even against reason, as Tertullian or Kierkegaard might suggest.
I remember Luther wasn't a big fan of reason in divine matters either. Called it something quite unflattering.
He could be quite suspicious of it, yes. Then there's Pascal's wager, not proof, but arguing it's prudent to bet on God existing. And more recently, Reformed epistemology, with figures like Alvin Plantinga.
Their idea is that belief in God can be properly basic, meaning it's rational on its own, without needing arguments, like how I believe the external world is real.
Exactly, like believing in other minds or trusting your memory. Plantinga argued we might have a kind of built-in sensus divinitatis, a sense of the divine, that makes belief rational without needing deductive proofs. It challenges the whole evidentialist demand.
So belief in God could be rational in a foundational way, not necessarily based on proving it from other facts.
That's the idea. So you see, there's no single answer. Most traditions probably find space for both faith and reason. Aquinas saw them as complementary. Kierkegaard saw faith as a leap beyond reason.
It seems the classic arguments for God are debated, not slam dunks. And many believers rely more on personal experience or tradition or spiritual feelings.
That's very true. Rational arguments are possible, but religious claims aren't quite like scientific ones you can test in a lab. Reason has limits, and that's where faith, experience, revelation often step in. Whether belief is rational depends a lot on your starting point, your epistemology. Are you an evidentialist, or do you allow for properly basic beliefs? It's an ongoing conversation.
And how we approach this whole faith-reason thing is heavily influenced by our background, right? Our religious tradition, our culture.
Massively. Your tradition shapes whether you even think God can be proven or if faith is the only way. It shapes how you balance reason, experience, scripture.
Take Christianity. You mentioned Aquinas and the Catholic tradition using reason, influenced by Greek philosophy. God's existence is knowable by reason, they'd say.
Generally, yes, though some truths of faith, like the Trinity, might go beyond reason. But then, as you said, the Protestant reformers like Luther and Calvin were more wary of unaided reason. They stressed scripture, faith, maybe that innate sensus divinitatis. Calvin talked about an awareness of God not derived from proof.
So even within one religion, you get different takes on reason's role. And practice matters too. Prayer, mystical experiences might feel more real than logic.
Absolutely. And look at Islam. Similar debates. Early theologians, the Mu'tazilates, really championed reason, even interpreting scripture rationally. They developed proofs for God's unity and justice.
But the mainstream view leaned more towards revelation.
The Asharite school, which became dominant, gave primacy to the Quran, with reason as a tool to understand it, but subordinate. Al-Ghazali famously critiqued philosophers like Avicenna and Averroes for relying too much on Greek logic about God, emphasizing mystical experience instead. Yet Avicenna and Averroes themselves offered very rigorous philosophical proofs.
So again, that tension between rationalism and faith, influenced by education, practice like Sufism, valuing direct experience.
Exactly. And Eastern traditions, even more diverse. Hinduism has the Nyāya school, focused on logic and proofs for God, but also Vedanta, grounding belief more in texts and meditation. And Bhakti devotional movements emphasize love and grace over intellect.
Experience through ritual and devotion becomes the convincing factor.
For many, yes. And Buddhism traditionally is non-theistic. The Buddha often discouraged speculating about God, focusing instead on escaping suffering. Reason is used for ethics, meditation, but not proving a creator. Some Buddhist philosophers even argued against a creator God.
It really shows how tradition frames the whole discussion, what counts as evidence, what authority rests on reason, that scriptural experience, even the concept of God being discussed. And social factors play a role too. Growing up in a faith community versus a secular one.
Definitely. If you're raised trusting a tradition, you might not feel the need for external proof. A strong community reinforces belief. In a more pluralistic setting, you might demand more objective reasons, be more critical of tradition alone.
So understanding this background is key to seeing why the debate isn't just abstract logic, but involves whole worldviews and ways of knowing. The approach to the divine really depends on context.
Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty, the actual arguments for God's existence.
Right. These are attempts to rationally demonstrate God's existence or show that atheism leads to contradictions. We can group them into types, conceptual ones like the ontological argument, and observational ones looking at the world, cosmological, teleological, moral arguments, and that karma-based one from Nyāya.
Let's start with the ontological one, pure logic, right? Proving God just from the idea of God.
Exactly. Anselm's version is the classic. God is a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. The argument goes, you can conceive of this greatest possible being.
Now, if this being only existed in your mind, it wouldn't be the greatest conceivable being, because a being that exists in reality as well would be greater.
So existence itself is part of being great.
That's the claim. Therefore, the greatest conceivable being, God, must exist in reality. To say the greatest being doesn't exist is supposedly a contradiction. Descartes had a similar idea. Existence is part of the essence of a perfect being, like three sides are part of the essence of a triangle.
It's clever trying to prove reality from a definition. But it got shot down pretty quickly, didn't it? Gonilo's perfect island.
That was a famous early criticism. Gonilo, a fellow monk, said you could use the same logic to prove the existence of a perfect lost island, which seems absurd. And later, Kant delivered a major blow.
His point was that existence is not a predicate. It's not a quality like red or powerful that adds to a concept.
Exactly. Kant argued that saying something exists doesn't add a property to its definition. It just asserts that the concept corresponds to something real. You can define a perfect being, but that definition doesn't guarantee its existence.
So you can't just build existence into the definition.
That's Kant's critique. Despite the criticisms, the ontological argument is still studied. It forces us to think about ideas and reality. But let's move to arguments based on the world around us, the cosmological arguments.
These feel more grounded. Arguments from the existence of the universe itself, tracing things back to a cause.
Right. They start with observations. Things exist, things are caused. Maybe the universe had a beginning and reason towards a first cause, or a necessary being, an ultimate explanation, which they identify as God.
Aquinas' first cause argument is probably the most famous. Everything needs a cause. Causes have prior causes. But you can't go back infinitely.
Aquinas argued an infinite regress is problematic. No ultimate start point means nothing could ever get started. So there must be a first uncaused cause, an unmoved mover, and that, he said, is God.
Then there's Leibniz's argument from contingency. Things exist that could have not existed. Contingency.
Yes. And Leibniz asked, why do these contingent things exist at all? There must be a sufficient reason. Contingent things can't explain themselves, and the explanation can't be just another contingent thing. So there must be a necessary being, something that has to exist and explains everything else.
And that necessary being is God.
That's the conclusion. Then there's the Kalam cosmological argument, which focuses specifically on the universe having a beginning.
This one uses modern science sometimes. Big Bang.
It often does, alongside philosophical arguments against an infinite past. The premises are, 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. 2, the universe began to exist. 3, therefore the universe has a cause.
And that cause must be pretty special, outside time and space. Powerful.
Exactly. Timeless, non-spatial, immensely powerful attributes pointing towards God, proponents argue. Al-Kindi al-Ghazali in the Islamic tradition, and modern philosophers like William Lane Craig have championed this.
But these arguments have counter-arguments too. Why can't the chain of causes be infinite?
That's a key objection. And the special pleading charge. If everything needs a cause, why is God exempt? Why not say the universe itself is the uncaused thing?
The answer is usually that God is necessary, not contingent like things in the universe.
That's the standard reply. Critics of Kalam might accept the universe began, but question if the cause has to be a personal God. Maybe some quantum fluctuation. Advocates might counter that creating space and time requires something like a mind or will making a choice.
Still, these arguments tap into that basic question. Why is there something rather than nothing?
They really do. Now, let's look at the teleological argument, the argument from design.
Paley's watchmaker. If you find a complex watch, you assume a watchmaker. If you look at complex nature, you assume a tower.
A divine watchmaker, a designer.
Yeah.
Exactly. Teleological comes from telos, meaning end or purpose. The argument sees evidence of purpose and design in the world.
Things like the human eye, DNA, the fine-tuning of physics, they seem too complex, too perfectly set up for life to be just chance.
That's the claim. These features exhibit marks of design that imply an intelligent creator arranged things. It was a very powerful argument before Darwin.
Ah, Darwin. Evolution by natural selection. That provided a natural way for complexity to arise without a designer, right?
It was a massive challenge. Natural selection, acting on random variations over millions of years, could explain things like the eye's complexity. And the problem of evil also bites here. If it's design, why the flaws, the cruelty? What does that say about the designer?
Hume also criticized it earlier, right? Weak analogy between watches and universes. We don't observe universe makers.
Hume made several key points. The analogy is flawed, and even if there was a designer, we couldn't necessarily conclude it was the infinite, perfect God of theism, maybe a committee of gods or a trainee god.
Okay. But modern versions focus on the fine-tuning of physics constants.
Yes, the idea that the fundamental laws and constants of the universe seem incredibly precisely set for life to exist. Critics suggest alternatives like the multiverse hypothesis, maybe our universe is just one of many with different laws, or unknown physical principles.
Still, the intuition is strong for many people. Nature looks designed.
It has enduring appeal. Okay, one more argument for God before we switch sides, the Nyāya argument from karma.
Right, the Hindu perspective. How does karma lead to God?
The Nyāya school argued that karma, the law of cause and effect for actions, shaping rebirth, needs an administrator. Karma itself is seen as an unintelligent principle. How does it ensure that actions lead to the correct results justly across lifetimes?
You need someone to keep score and distribute the outcomes fairly.
Essentially, yes. An intelligent overseer, Īśvara, or God, is needed to manage the complexities of karma and ensure cosmic justice. It's a moral argument. The moral order implied by karma requires a moral governor.
That's fascinating. A different route to a similar conclusion as some Western moral arguments. Did other Indian schools buy it?
No, not universally. Buddhists rejected it, as did the Mimamsa school of Hinduism. Mimamsa argued karma works automatically, like a natural law, no deity required. They also raised the problem of suffering. Why do good people suffer if God is managing karma perfectly? It echoes the problem of evil.
So, similar debates played out there too. It shows theism isn't just Abrahamic, and arguments for a moral order are widespread. Okay, now for the arguments against God's existence.
Let's turn to the challenges. Philosophical atheism and skepticism raise serious questions, especially for that classical omni-God. We'll focus on three big ones our source highlights: the problem of evil, the omnipotence paradox, and inconsistent revelations.
Starting with the problem of evil. This feels like the most powerful one for many people, emotionally and intellectually.
It's definitely a major hurdle. The core question, if God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good, as philosophers sometimes abbreviate it, why does evil exist, especially horrendous, seemingly pointless suffering?
The logical formulation lays it out starkly, doesn't it? If God is he can prevent evil, knows about evil, and wants to prevent evil. But evil exists.
So, there's a contradiction. Either God doesn't exist, or God lacks one or more of those attributes. It highlights the apparent incompatibility between God's supposed perfection and the reality of infant deaths, genocides, natural disasters, cruelty.
Epicurus raised it ages ago, right?
Yeah?
And modern philosophers like J.L. Mackie pressed the logical version hard.
Yes. There's the logical problem, any evil is incompatible, and the evidential problem, the sheer amount and types of evil make God's existence highly improbable. It basically says the traditional God concept doesn't fit the facts of the world.
Now, theists have responses, theodicies, defenses.
Right. The free will defense is common. God values free creatures, and freedom unfortunately allows for moral evil. Evil is the price of freedom.
Or the soul-making theodicy. Suffering helps us grow morally and spiritually built character, like training in a gym, but much harder.
John Hick developed that idea. Others suggest we need evil to appreciate good, the contrast defense, or that evils permit greater goods we can't see, or it's all part of an inscrutable divine plan.
But the sheer scale of suffering, especially seemingly pointless suffering, it makes those explanations hard to swallow for many.
It remains incredibly difficult. Some theists respond by saying our perspective is limited, or they modify the concept of God. Maybe God isn't fully omnipotent in the classical sense, like in process theology, but the evidential argument from evil is often seen as the strongest inductive case against the traditional God.
Okay, next challenge. The omnipotence paradox. Back to the heavy stone.
Yes, this targets omnipotence directly, trying to show the concept itself is incoherent. Can God create a stone so heavy he cannot lift it?
If yes, he's not omnipotent, can't lift it. If no, he's not omnipotent, can't create it. Catch 22.
Exactly. It seems to force a contradiction. Other versions ask if God can create a task he can't do or break a law he can't break. Can God make 2 + 2 5?
It highlights the weirdness of can do absolutely anything.
The standard theological fix, as we mentioned, is to say omnipotence means power to do anything logically possible. Creating a stone God cannot lift is arguably a logical contradiction. Like a married bachelor, it's describing nonsense, not a real limitation on power.
So the paradox is just a linguistic trick based on a contradictory request.
That's the common resolution. Not everyone accepts it fully. Where exactly are the bounds of logic versus God's power? Could God choose to limit himself? Descartes, as we noted, might have thought God could do the logically impossible.
But if God can violate logic, then rational talk about God seems impossible anyway.
Pretty much. So the paradox doesn't disprove all gods, but it targets a naive view of omnipotence. It forces theists to refine the concept. If Almighty is inherently incoherent, then such a being can't exist. But since theists usually qualify it, the debate shifts to whether the qualifications work.
It's a challenge to define God's power carefully. Okay, the third argument. Inconsistent revelations.
This one comes from looking at the world's religions. You have Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Judaism, Buddhism, countless others, all claiming unique insights or revelations from the divine.
And their core claims often contradict each other, right? How you get salvation, the nature of God, or ultimate reality, who Jesus was. They can't all be true.
Exactly. If an all-knowing, all-powerful God wanted humanity to know the truth, why so confusion with so many mutually exclusive messages? Voltaire and others pointed this out. How do you rationally choose when each religion claims its own miracles and proofs?
The expectation might be one clear message if there's one true God. The diversity suggests something else.
It suggests perhaps that none have the full truth, or that they are human inventions reflecting different cultures and histories. As one source put it, you can't pick one over another based on their revelations since they conflict. It casts doubt on any God revealing specific doctrines if the messages are irreconcilable.
An all-knowing God wanting us to know him could presumably do better. Religious diversity looks more like what you'd expect if humans were just figuring things out themselves.
That's the skeptical conclusion. Now, responses vary. Some say, my religion is the true one, the others are mistakes, often explained by free will, human error, or even demonic influence.
Or the pluralist view. Maybe all religions grasp part of the truth, and the contradictions aren't as deep as they seem.
That's another approach, though, reconciling really fundamental doctrinal differences, like, is Jesus divine or just a prophet, is tricky. Then there's divine hiddenness. Maybe God intentionally isn't obvious, allowing multiple paths to test faith or respect freedom.
But that hiddenness idea can be flipped, right? Schellenberg argued a loving God would make himself known to sincere seekers. The fact that billions live and die in conflicting faiths suggests such a God isn't there, or isn't perfectly loving.
Precisely. The argument from inconsistent revelations, often linked with divine hiddenness, basically says the religious landscape of the world looks more like human creativity and cultural evolution than the work of a single guiding divine entity communicating clearly. It pushes towards relativism or skepticism about a personal, communicating God.
So, alongside the problem of evil, this is another major reason atheists give for disbelief. The data just doesn't seem to fit the hypothesis of one true revealing God.
It's a powerful argument based on the observable diversity of human religious belief and practice.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a lot of ground here, from defining God in its many forms to the attributes of the classical omni-God, the complex dance of faith and reason, the influence of tradition, and then diving into these classic arguments both for and against God's existence.
It really is a journey through centuries of deep thought. We've seen arguments based on pure logic, on observations of the cosmos, on morality, on karma, and countered by challenges from evil, logic paradoxes, and religious diversity.
And it's clear these aren't just Western concerns. Philosophers in Islamic, Hindu, and other traditions have wrestled with very similar questions, alongside their own unique perspectives. And the approaches vary wildly, too. Reason, faith, experience, tradition all playing different roles.
And the debate, as you said, is far from over. There are no simple knockdown proofs on either side that convince everyone. That's perhaps the most important takeaway.
So the goal isn't necessarily finding the right answer, but understanding the arguments, the concepts, the complexities, appreciating the different viewpoints.
Exactly. Philosophy aims for clarity, critical thinking, understanding the strengths and weaknesses of different positions, learning the terminology ontological, cosmological, theodicy, fideism gives you the tools to engage with these ideas yourself.
And studying this stuff, whether you're a believer or not, tells us a lot about ourselves, doesn't it? About human reason, our values, our search for meaning. It definitely sharpens your thinking.
Absolutely. Both theism and atheism, and agnosticism for that matter, have serious intellectual arguments behind them. Approaching it openly is key. These ultimate questions about reality, knowledge, good and evil have driven human thought forever.
A universal answer might be impossible, but the exploration itself is valuable. It connects metaphysics, ethics, epistemology, all centered around this concept of God.
It's a testament to the richness of philosophy, this ongoing conversation across millennia. And maybe, just maybe, the most profound thing isn't finding a final answer, but realizing the depth and persistence of the questions themselves. What does it tell us about the human condition that we can't stop asking?